The guests laughed. Crystal glasses clinked. The billionaire Charles Whitmore raised his voice above the noise and pointed at the maid who had just dared to sit at his piano. "Look at her. Our servant wants to be a musician now." Laughter erupted like thunder, cruel and merciless. Evelyn, the maid, felt her cheeks burn with shame. Her rough hands, used to scrubbing floors, now trembled on the polished keys. She could run. She could disappear. But deep inside, a voice whispered, "Don't run. Play." And when Evelyn pressed the first chord, the room fell silent. What happened next would not only silence the laughter of the rich, but shake the entire city, and uncover secrets the billionaire had buried for decades. Because sometimes, the hands that clean are the same hands that can change the world. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. The night was warm, but the Whitmore mansion gleamed like a European palace. Outside, rows of luxury cars lined the driveway. Chauffeurs stood waiting in perfect order while men in dark suits checked the guest list at the entrance. Inside, crystal chandeliers shone like constellations, tables draped in silk and rare flower arrangements filled the air with an almost suffocating perfume. It was the night of the grand charity dinner of Charles Whitmore, the billionaire who prided himself on funding social causes, so long as they brought him headlines and applause. Tall, with perfectly combed silver hair, Charles moved across the room like a king in his castle, surrounded by businessmen, politicians, and celebrities. His broad smile barely hid the cold eyes of a man used to commanding and never being questioned. Among the hurried waiters and silent staff stood Evelyn, a black woman in her mid-40s. She wore the house uniform, navy blue with a spotless apron and shoes worn thin from endless shifts. Her hands were rough, scarred by years of scrubbing, polishing, and carrying. Yet there was a delicate grace in her movements, a quiet strength that few ever noticed. As she cleared empty glasses and folded crumpled napkins, Evelyn kept her eyes down, as she always did. That was how she survived. Invisible, quiet, unnoticed. But that night something was different. Something was calling her. An old, buried memory. In the far corner of the grand hall, bathed in golden light, stood a black grand piano polished to a mirror shine. It gleamed brighter than the diamond necklaces on the wealthy women parading around the room. Evelyn froze. Her heart raced. It felt as if a forgotten part of her soul had suddenly awakened. She drifted closer, almost without realizing. Her fingers traced the smooth wood, trembling, reverent, like greeting an old friend after years apart. The guests were lost in their chatter and laughter, too distracted to notice. Daring for the first time in years, Evelyn lowered herself onto the piano bench. She pressed a single key. The sound was pure, tender, like a drop of water in the desert, but the magic shattered in an instant. From across the room, a booming laugh cut through the air. Charles Whitmore, champagne glass in hand, was pointing straight at her. His laughter echoed, quickly joined by the circle of powerful men and jeweled women around him. "Well, well, what do we have here?" he sneered. "Our maid has decided to give us a concert." Laughter erupted. Some guests laughed openly. Others tried to hide their smirks behind their hands. Evelyn's face burned hot with shame. "Maybe she'll teach us Beethoven between trays of hors d'oeuvres," Charles continued, setting off another round of cruel laughter. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. She tried to rise, but her legs refused. Her trembling hands still rested on the keys. "Back to work, woman," Charles said sharply, his voice laced with contempt. "The piano is not a toy for people like you." The laughter came again, harsher, louder. It was as if the entire hall had turned against her. Evelyn lowered her gaze, humiliated, but deep within memories rushed back. The afternoons she had once stolen at the community conservatory, the lessons secretly taken, the hours of practice on an old borrowed piano. Tears threatened to fall, but Evelyn took a deep breath. The humiliation burned her, yes, but within that fire something else stirred. Something greater. A silent voice inside her whispered, "Don't run. Play." The guests kept laughing, unaware that those tired, calloused hands carried a secret that would soon silence them all. The laughter still echoed in the hall like a cruel chorus. Evelyn's face burned. Her body screamed to flee, to disappear into the shadows where no one could see her shame. But something stronger held her to that bench. Her fingers, rough from scrubbing floors and carrying buckets, trembled on the polished keys. For years they had been tools of labor, unseen, undervalued. Yet once, long ago, they had been instruments of beauty, instruments of music. She closed her eyes. The humiliation became a roar inside her chest, but then, silence. In that silence, she remembered. The smell of chalk and wood from the small community conservatory where she used to sneak in as a teenager. The soft voice of the teacher who once told her, "You play with your heart, Evelyn. Never let anyone take that away from you." A single tear rolled down her cheek. She inhaled deeply. And then, without permission, without apology, her fingers began to move. The first chord rose, strong and deliberate, cutting through the cruel laughter like a blade through silk. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses hovered in the air, untouched. Heads turned. Evelyn's hands flowed across the keys, not with the stiffness of a servant trying to impress, but with the natural grace of someone born to speak through music. Each note carried her pain, her hope, her defiance. At first the guests looked on with disbelief. Charles Whitmore narrowed his eyes, ready to make another joke, but the words stuck in his throat. The melody was powerful, alive. It demanded silence. A woman in a sparkling gown lowered her glass slowly, her eyes moistening. A young man near the fireplace tilted his head as if hearing something he had never known before. The atmosphere shifted. Where moments ago there had been ridicule, now there was awe. Evelyn's uniform, her tired face, her station in life, all disappeared in that moment. She was no longer the maid. She was the music. The final notes lingered, hovering in the air like a prayer. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was Evelyn's breathing, heavy and trembling, as her hands rested still upon the piano. And then, silence. Not laughter, not applause. Just silence. Thick, uncomfortable, almost reverent. Evelyn slowly lifted her gaze. Dozens of eyes were fixed on her, no longer mocking. Some wide with surprise, some softened with shame, some shining with tears. But among them, one pair of eyes burned with rage. Charles Whitmore's. He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. The powerful man who had laughed moments before now clenched his jaw, furious that the woman he had humiliated had stolen his spotlight. And in that silence, Evelyn understood something. She had crossed a line. She had shown them a piece of herself that could never be unseen. The silence in the hall was suffocating. Evelyn's final note still seemed to float in the air, shimmering like fragile glass. For a moment, no one dared breathe. Then, something unexpected happened. A woman in a green silk gown, seated near the front, lifted her hand to her mouth. A tear slid down her cheek. She whispered, almost to herself, "My God, she plays with her soul." Others shifted uncomfortably, as if awakening from a spell. A man who had laughed the loudest minutes earlier now looked away, ashamed, swirling his untouched wine glass. The cruel mockery that had filled the room moments before dissolved into uneasy silence and quiet astonishment. Evelyn kept her gaze low, afraid to meet their eyes. But her fingers refused to stop. They moved again, this time with more confidence, weaving a melody that rose and fell like waves. Each chord carried a story, the weight of years of silence, the pain of prejudice, the strength of survival. The guests listened, some leaning forward, drawn closer to the sound. The laughter that had mocked her had been replaced by something far more powerful. Respect. Charles Whitmore, however, sat frozen in his chair. His grip on the champagne glass tightened, knuckles white. His smile was gone. This was no longer amusing. This was dangerous. "Enough," he muttered under his breath. But no one heard him. No one was looking at him anymore. All eyes were fixed on Evelyn. Her music shifted, no longer just sorrow, but defiance. Each note struck the air like a declaration. I am more than what you see. I am more than what you allow me to be. A hush fell over the room as Evelyn's performance reached its peak. The music filled every corner, climbed the crystal chandeliers, seeped into the marble floors. It wrapped itself around each listener, forcing them to feel what she had carried in silence for so many years. And then it happened. Something no one expected. An older gentleman in the back, a retired judge, stood from his chair. He wiped his eyes, voice trembling. That is not the sound of a maid. That is the sound of an artist. His words broke the fragile silence. Murmurs spread. A woman whispered, how could she hide such talent? Another added, she shouldn't be serving drinks. She should be on a stage. But not all hearts were moved. A group of men exchanged looks of irritation. One muttered harshly, this is inappropriate. She doesn't belong here. The old poison of prejudice still lingered, fighting to regain ground. Evelyn's music, however, refused to bow. With one final crescendo, her fingers brought the room to its knees. The last chord thundered, echoed, then faded into silence once again. This time the silence was different, heavy, sacred. And then, a single clap. It came from the back, then another, and another, until a ripple of applause spread across the hall. Some clapped timidly, others with conviction. A few refused entirely, their faces tight with resentment. But the sound of approval could not be silenced. Evelyn raised her eyes at last. Her chest heaved. She saw tears, admiration, disbelief. But in the corner, she also saw Charles Whitmore's face. Red, stiff. His pride shattered. He had tried to reduce her to nothing. But she had answered without a single word, only with music. And that music had left a scar on every soul in that room. The applause still echoed faintly when Evelyn stood from the piano. Her hands trembled, not from fear this time, but from release. She had poured her soul into the keys, and for a fleeting moment she felt free. But freedom in Charles Whitmore's mansion was dangerous. The billionaire rose slowly from his chair. His lips curved into a smile, but his eyes were sharp as blades. The guests turned toward him, waiting to see his reaction. Evelyn lowered her gaze, expecting the humiliation to return. Well, Charles said, voice dripping with forced charm, that was entertaining. Our Evelyn has hidden talents, it seems. Some guests chuckled nervously, unsure whether to agree or stay silent. Evelyn bowed her head, retreating quickly from the piano. She wanted to vanish, to slip back into the shadows where she had always survived. She picked up a silver tray left on a nearby table, but as she moved, something caught her eye. A framed photograph sat atop a grand bookshelf near the piano. Unlike the other portraits of Charles shaking hands with politicians and celebrities, this picture was different. It showed a young woman, graceful, radiant, seated at the very same piano. Her hands hovered above the keys with elegance, her smile warm and confident. Behind her, faintly in the background, Evelyn recognized something that made her heart stop. A banner that read South Carolina Conservatory of Music. Evelyn's breath caught. Memories flooded back. She remembered that place. She remembered sneaking into its old practice rooms as a child, listening through the doors, dreaming of one day being allowed inside. It was there she had touched her first piano, guided by kind teachers who saw a spark in her. But the conservatory had closed decades ago, abandoned after funding dried up. How could this picture be here, in Whitmore's mansion? Her eyes lingered too long on the photograph. What are you staring at, Evelyn? Charles's voice cut through her thoughts like a whip. She jolted, almost dropping the tray. Nothing, sir, forgive me. But Charles narrowed his eyes. He followed her gaze to the photograph and, for a brief second, his expression changed. It was not annoyance this time. It was something darker. A flicker of recognition. Perhaps even fear. Quickly, he reached for the picture frame and turned it face down. Old memories, he muttered coldly. Nothing worth your attention. The guests barely noticed, busy whispering about Evelyn's performance. But Evelyn had seen enough. That photograph was not nothing. It was a clue, a piece of her own story buried inside the walls of the mansion of the man who despised her. As she returned to her duties, Evelyn's mind raced. Who was the woman in the picture? Why was the banner of her childhood conservatory in the background? And why had Charles reacted with such unease? For the first time, Evelyn realized her connection to this world might run deeper than anyone imagined. And maybe, just maybe, the piano in Charles Whitmore's mansion had been waiting for her all along. The night ended, but the echoes of Evelyn's performance did not. Guests left the mansion in a swirl of chatter, some shaken, some inspired, others angered. Charles Whitmore pretended everything was under control, but inside he boiled with fury. Evelyn slipped back into the servants' quarters, her body exhausted, yet her spirit strangely alive. She replayed the music in her mind, each note a rebellion against years of silence. She didn't know it yet, but her life had already changed. Because someone had been recording. A young catering assistant, ignored like Evelyn, invisible in that world of wealth, had captured the entire moment on his phone. Charles's cruel laughter, the humiliation, and then Evelyn's breathtaking performance. The next morning, the video hit the internet. Within hours, it spread across the city like wildfire. The headline read, "The Maid Who Silenced the Billionaire." Social media exploded. Thousands of comments poured in. Some voices were filled with awe. "She plays better than half the pianists I've seen in concert halls. God gave her this gift. No one can laugh at her again. This woman deserves a stage, not a mop." But the hatred was just as loud. "She should know her place. These bleeding hearts don't understand class. That's Whitmore's piano, she had no right to touch it." The city was divided. On the subway, strangers whispered about it. In beauty salons, women replayed the clip on their phones, shaking their heads in disbelief. In boardrooms, executives debated whether Whitmore had been humiliated beyond repair. And Evelyn? She had no idea what was happening. She only found out 3 days later, when she walked into a grocery store near her small apartment. People stared. Some smiled warmly, nodding in admiration. Others sneered, whispering behind her back. At the register, the cashier leaned in, eyes wide. "It's you, isn't it? You're the woman from the video." Evelyn froze, clutching her bag of rice. I don't know what you mean." But the cashier only smiled softly. "Don't hide. The world has finally seen you." Her knees went weak. Evelyn left quickly, her heart pounding. That night she opened her old laptop and typed her own name into the search bar. Hundreds of articles, thousands of comments, endless shares. Her face was everywhere, and so was Charles's. Clips of his cruel laughter were replayed on news channels, dissected by talk shows, mocked in late-night comedy. His empire trembled. What was supposed to be a night of triumph had become a public wound. In the city streets, Evelyn's story had become a symbol. For some, she was hope. For others, she was an offense. But above all, she was no longer invisible. The city buzzed with Evelyn's name. News crews camped outside the mansion gates. Activists gathered in front with signs. And the Whitmore family tried to bury the scandal with carefully crafted statements. But Evelyn, hidden in her small apartment, was terrified. She had not asked for any of this. She had only touched the piano, only answered cruelty with music. And yet, her life was no longer her own. It was then that Rachel Donovan, a young civil rights attorney, knocked on her door. Tall, with sharp eyes and a calm but determined voice, Rachel introduced herself simply. "Miss Evelyn, I believe they've done more to you than just laugh. May I see your contract?" Evelyn hesitated. She had never trusted lawyers, never trusted anyone who claimed to fight for the poor. Too many promises, Too many betrayals. But something in Rachel's eyes convinced her. Slowly, Evelyn fetched a folder from under her bed, a copy of her employment contract with the Whitmore estate. Rachel sat at the small kitchen table, spreading out the papers. She read in silence, her brow furrowing deeper and deeper. Then, she stopped. She tapped a paragraph with her finger, her voice tightening. "Here, do you see this?" Evelyn leaned in. The clause was written in cold legal language, buried among the rules about uniforms, cleaning duties, and working hours. But its meaning was clear. Household staff are strictly prohibited from engaging with or making use of the grand piano or any musical instruments on the property. Violation of this rule will be grounds for immediate termination. Evelyn's stomach turned. They put that in writing? Rachel nodded, fury in her voice. This isn't just arrogance. This is calculated humiliation. They put a wall between you and the very thing you were born to do. This clause isn't about property. It's about control. Evelyn trembled. She remembered Charles's laughter, his words. The piano is not a toy for people like you. Now she understood. It wasn't a spontaneous insult. It was law in his house. Law designed to remind her every day of her place. Rachel leaned closer. Evelyn, this is bigger than you. This isn't just discrimination, it's systemic. It's abuse of power, written into a contract. We can fight this. Evelyn shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. Fight him? He's Charles Whitmore. He has everything, money, lawyers, influence. You're not just anything. Rachel interrupted firmly. You're the woman who silenced a room with her music. The city already knows your name. You have a gift, and now you have proof of their cruelty. That makes you powerful. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt something stir inside her. Hope. Fragile, trembling, but real. She picked up the contract again, staring at the hateful clause. And for the first time, instead of feeling small, she felt anger rising, a righteous anger. Then let's fight, she whispered. Rachel smiled. Good. Because this clause? It won't survive the light of day. Outside, the city lights glowed like distant stars. The world was watching, and the battle had just begun. Days passed, and the scandal refused to die. The video of Evelyn's performance had been replayed millions of times. Rachel prepared her legal arguments, building a case around the humiliating clause. But there was a piece of the story Evelyn could not shake. The photograph she had seen in the mansion. That image haunted her dreams. The young woman seated gracefully at the piano with the banner of the South Carolina Conservatory of Music behind her. Who was she? Why had Charles hidden the picture so quickly, almost with fear? The answer came unexpectedly. One afternoon, while Rachel and Evelyn sorted through old news clippings and archives, Rachel froze. She turned her laptop toward Evelyn. On the screen was a yellowed newspaper article from nearly 25 years ago. Headline: Promising pianist Catherine Whitmore brings hope to disadvantaged youth. There she was, the woman from the photograph. Beautiful, radiant, alive with passion. The article told of Catherine, Charles's first wife, a pianist who had dedicated her life to mentoring poor and minority students, giving them access to instruments and lessons they would otherwise never afford. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. She whispered, She believed in us. Rachel nodded gravely. And she was silenced. The article says Catherine died in a tragic car accident. But look, this piano, the one in Whitmore's mansion, was her instrument, her legacy. Evelyn's heart pounded. She remembered Charles's words, his mocking laughter, the cruel clause forbidding her from ever touching those keys. And now she understood. The piano wasn't his trophy. It was hers, Catherine's. A woman who had fought for people like Evelyn, whose hands had been silenced too soon. But there was more. Rachel scrolled further. Another clipping showed Catherine with a young girl, her daughter. A smiling child with bright eyes, holding her mother's hand. Charles has a daughter? Evelyn asked softly. Yes, Rachel replied. Her name is Grace Whitmore. She disappeared from the public eye after her mother's death. But Evelyn, if Grace remembers her mother's mission, she could be the key to this case. That night, Evelyn sat alone in her small living room, staring at the faded contract and the new clippings spread on the table. The pieces fit together in a cruel irony. The man who had mocked her, who had buried her gift beneath years of servitude, had once been married to a woman who believed in everything he despised. The piano had not been placed in that mansion to mock her. It had survived there like a forgotten witness, waiting for the right hands to awaken it again. And Evelyn realized with a shiver that her performance that night had not only been defiance, it had been a resurrection. Catherine's voice, silenced by tragedy, had spoken again through Evelyn's music. The piano did not belong to Charles. It belonged to Catherine. And now it belonged to every dreamer Charles had tried to silence. The city had not stopped talking. Evelyn's music had become more than a viral moment. It was a movement. Street musicians played her melody in subway stations. Churches spoke of her story in Sunday sermons. For many, Evelyn was living proof that dignity could rise even from humiliation. One morning, as Evelyn prepared a simple breakfast in her small kitchen, there was a knock at the door. When she opened it, she found two elegantly dressed representatives from the New York Philharmonic Foundation. They introduced themselves with warm smiles, placing an envelope in her trembling hands. Inside was a letter written on embossed paper. "We are honored to invite Ms. Evelyn Carter to perform at our upcoming gala for emerging talent. The city has already heard your music. Now it deserves to witness it on a stage worthy of your gift." Evelyn's breath caught. Her knees weakened. For a moment she thought she might collapse. She read the letter again and again, as if afraid it might vanish. Tears blurred her vision. Rachel, standing behind her, grinned with pride. "Evelyn, this is it. This is your chance. Not just to defend yourself, but to stand in the place you were always meant to." But good news travels fast, and so does envy. That same evening, Charles Whitmore received the call. His face turned crimson as the foundation's chairman politely informed him of their decision to feature Evelyn. To Charles, it was the ultimate insult. His maid, the woman he had ridiculed, standing under the bright lights of a prestigious stage. He slammed the phone onto his desk, his voice a low growl. "Over my dead body." The next day, Evelyn received another letter, this one delivered by courier in a thick, ominous envelope bearing Whitmore's seal. It was a formal cease and desist order, claiming that Evelyn had violated her contract, defamed her employer, and had no right to accept public invitations without his approval. At the bottom, in bold letters, "If you proceed, we will not only terminate your employment, but we will destroy you financially and legally." Evelyn's hands shook as she read. Fear flooded back. The walls of her tiny apartment seemed to close in. Memories of debts, of nights hungry, of years cleaning floors just to survive, all came crashing down. How could she possibly stand against a man who owned half the city? Rachel, however, was furious. She snatched the letter from Evelyn's trembling hands. "This is intimidation, plain and simple. He knows he's losing, Evelyn. That's why he's trying to scare you." Evelyn sat down, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Rachel, what if he's right? What if I lose everything? I'm not made for courtrooms, I'm not made for stages, I'm just—" Rachel knelt in front of her, gripping her hands firmly. "You are not just anything. You are the woman who silenced a room with her music, and if Whitmore is so desperate to stop you, it means you're already winning. The choice is yours, Evelyn. Will you let his threats define you, or will you play?" Evelyn closed her eyes. The silence stretched. And then softly but firmly she answered, "I will play." Rachel smiled, her eyes shining with both pride and fire. "Then let him come. We'll be ready." That night, as Evelyn sat alone, she touched the worn keys of an old second-hand keyboard she kept hidden in her closet. It wasn't a grand piano, but it was enough. She practiced until her fingers ached, whispering to herself between notes. "They can laugh, they can threaten, but I was born to play." And in the Whitmore mansion, Charles plotted his next move. Unaware that his own daughter Grace had been watching the storm quietly, ready to step into the light. The courthouse buzzed with cameras, reporters shouting questions, and protesters holding signs. Some bore Evelyn's name in bold letters. Let her play. Others carried darker messages. Stay in your place. The city was divided, and today all eyes turned to the trial. Inside, the courtroom was tense. Evelyn sat beside Rachel at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wore a simple dress, nothing extravagant, but her dignity filled the room. Across from her, Charles Whitmore sat with an army of lawyers in sharp suits, their briefcases stacked like weapons. He leaned back confidently as if the outcome had already been purchased. The judge entered, a stern woman with eyes that missed nothing. The gavel struck. This court is now in session. The opening statements clashed like thunder. Rachel spoke with fire. This is not just about a contract. This is about dignity stolen, talent silenced, and systemic discrimination written into law by the powerful to keep the humble in chains. Charles's lead attorney responded coldly. The plaintiff was a maid. She violated clear terms of employment. This case is nothing but an attempt to exploit a viral moment for personal gain. Evelyn's stomach tightened, but Rachel squeezed her hand under the table. Trust me, she whispered. The truth will speak. Then came the testimonies. First, a former butler from the Whitmore mansion took the stand. His voice shook as he admitted, "It wasn't just Evelyn. That clause was meant to humiliate all of us. Mr. Whitmore used to joke that we should never forget our place, that even the piano was too good for our hands." Gasps filled the room. Charles's jaw tightened. Next came a housemaid, elderly and frail. She told of nights when she overheard Catherine Whitmore, Charles's late wife, begging him to allow the staff's children to learn music. She wanted to open the piano to them, the maid said softly, but he refused. After she died, he made sure no one touched it again. Whispers spread among the spectators. The contrast was clear. Catherine had built bridges, Charles had built walls. Then, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. A young woman entered, elegant but modest, her face pale with nerves. Rachel smiled knowingly. Evelyn's heart skipped. She recognized her from the newspaper clipping. It was Grace Whitmore, Charles's estranged daughter. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Miss Whitmore, you may take the stand." The room fell silent. Charles shifted in his chair, fury flashing in his eyes. "Grace, don't you dare," he hissed, but the judge silenced him with a gavel strike. Grace's voice trembled at first but grew stronger with each word. "I am here because the truth must be told. That piano was my mother's. She believed it belonged to everyone who had music in their soul. After her death, my father turned it into a symbol of his control. He buried her dream under his pride. But when Evelyn touched those keys, it was as if my mother's voice returned. I cannot stand by while he destroys that again." The courtroom erupted, some gasping, some applauding, the judge banging her gavel for silence. Evelyn sat frozen, tears streaming down her face. Grace looked at her and nodded, as if passing a torch. Charles's mask cracked. His lawyers scrambled, but the damage was done. The testimony had pierced the fortress of power. Rachel rose for her closing argument, her voice ringing through the chamber. This case is not just about Evelyn Carter. It is about every servant who has been told they are less, every talent buried under prejudice, every dream stolen by arrogance. The defendant mocked her, silenced her, and even wrote laws in his house to forbid her gift. But Evelyn answered not with anger, not with violence, she answered with music. And that music revealed the truth. She is not a servant of his house. She is a servant of art, of dignity, of God's own gift. The judge's gaze fell on Charles, whose face was red with rage, and then on Evelyn, whose head was bowed humbly. The gavel struck once more. This court will deliver its verdict tomorrow morning. The room exploded with noise as the session ended. Reporters ran for the doors. Charles stormed out, his lawyers scrambling behind him. Evelyn sat still, trembling. Rachel leaned close and whispered, "No matter what they decide tomorrow, Evelyn, the world already knows the truth." And deep inside, Evelyn believed it. The courthouse steps were flooded with reporters the next morning. Cameras flashed, microphones crowded the air, and the city held its breath. Inside, Evelyn sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, her heart pounding like a drum. The judge entered. Silence fell. The gavel struck. After reviewing the evidence and testimonies, this court finds that the clause in the Whitmore employment contract is discriminatory, humiliating, and unlawful. Furthermore, the court recognizes that Evelyn Carter was subjected to public ridicule and psychological harm. The defendant, Charles Whitmore, is ordered to issue a public apology, pay damages, and remove all such clauses from his employment policies. The room erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, and people applauded despite the judge's calls for order. Evelyn sat frozen, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in decades, justice had spoken her name. Charles, however, remained rigid. His pride was his prison. He stood glaring at Evelyn, his voice dripping with venom. "You may have won the court, but you will never belong in our world." But his words rang hollow, because even as he spoke, an invitation was being prepared outside those walls, one that would change everything. The gala night, 2 weeks later, the Grand Concert Hall of New York City glittered under golden lights. The philanthropic gala for emerging talent was the event of the year. The stage was set, the audience filled with dignitaries, musicians, critics, and ordinary citizens who had followed Evelyn's story. Backstage, Evelyn stood in a simple gown. She held her hands close to her chest, trembling, not from fear but from the weight of the moment. Rachel adjusted her shoulders, whispering, "Tonight you are not a maid. You are the voice of every soul that's ever been silenced. Play, Evelyn. Play for all of us." The announcer's voice echoed through the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Evelyn Carter." The spotlight fell. Applause thundered. Evelyn walked slowly to the grand piano at center stage. She sat, breathing deeply, closing her eyes. The memory of Charles's laughter flickered in her mind. But so did Catherine's picture, Grace's testimony, Rachel's courage, and above all, the quiet voice that had once told her, "Don't run. Play." Her fingers touched the keys. The first notes rose, tender and trembling, then stronger, fuller. A river of sound flowed from her hands, filling the vast hall. It was not just music. It was defiance, healing, and prayer. Every chord carried the weight of years she had been silenced, and every crescendo carried the voice of those who had been told they were less. The audience leaned forward, many already in tears. Critics who had come with skepticism now scribbled furiously, struggling to capture the impossible. Grace Whitmore sat in the front row, tears streaming as she whispered, "Mother, she did it." And then Evelyn's eyes lifted. She looked out into the crowd, and there, standing in the shadows, was Charles Whitmore. He had come, not to applaud, but to see if she would falter. But Evelyn did not falter. Her hands struck the keys with fire. The hall shook with sound. The music swelled into a triumphant crescendo, then softened into a prayer-like finale, a whisper of grace and forgiveness. When the last note faded, the silence was absolute. And then, an eruption. The audience rose to its feet. Applause thundered like a storm. Cries of encore echoed through the hall. Evelyn stood, tears flowing freely, her chest heaving. For the first time she bowed not as a servant but as an artist. Charles turned to leave, his power broken. But the city no longer cared for his wealth or his arrogance. The story now belonged to Evelyn. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn became a symbol. Invitations poured in. Music schools asked her to teach. Concert halls opened their doors. But Evelyn never forgot her roots. She chose to dedicate part of her time to a community conservatory, reviving the very mission Catherine Whitmore had once dreamed of. As she played for children who had never touched a piano before, Evelyn smiled through tears. She whispered softly, almost as a prayer, "God does not abandon the just. The world tried to bury me, but he gave me music to rise again." And so the maid who once scrubbed floors now lifted hearts. The laughter that once mocked her had been silenced by the thunder of applause, because in the end, justice did not come through wealth or power. It came through truth, courage, and the sound of her hands on the piano. Have you ever lived through something like this? Have you ever been humiliated, yet found the strength to rise again? Share your story in the comments. Believe this. Justice may take time, but it always arrives. Never lose hope. In the end, good always wins.